Well, we got through monetary policy. Now it's time to get to the other type of major macroeconomic policy, and that's fiscal policy. When we're talking about fiscal policy, we're moving into a different realm of decision making. We're going away from the Fed, and now we're looking at the behaviors of our elected officials, the politicians, the representatives, the senators, the president, who get to decide the course of actions that are taken in terms of taxing and spending. Those are the primary components of fiscal policy. Of course, if we look at aggregate demand, there is that government spending component, and now we're talking about actively manipulating that. And we're also talking about taxes. Taxes can have an impact on your what we call disposable income, how much you can spend, so that affects consumption. It also affects businesses, specifically how much how much profit businesses can earn, and what types of things businesses spend their money on, whether it's investment spending or whether it's just kind of stocking money away for the future. So we're going to jump into fiscal policy here with both feet. Of course, we have a presidential election coming up, and hopefully it will go off smoothly coming up later this year, and hopefully we'll get to hear from the candidates as well, and I'm sure that we'll talk about their plans for fiscal policy. More than likely, they will talk about how they're going to use fiscal policy to stimulate the economy and try to bring the economy back from where from kind of this brink of disaster that we're kind of just on the edge of. So it's important to understand fiscal policy and what the ramifications of fiscal policy are. So let's get right into it. So again, fiscal policy is the taxing and spending of government. Government wants us to pay our taxes, of course, and governments also have to spend money. That's one of the things we expect them to do with the tax money they collect. Fiscal policy as a whole is conducted by the government at the federal level anyway. It's the House of Representatives and the White House and the Senate, and they all kind of get together and discuss what they think the plan should be. Should we raise taxes? Should we lower taxes? Should we spend more? Should we spend less? Should we spend more in this particular area? Should we spend less in this particular area? This is the Congress and the President getting together at the macro level to try to decide what are we going to do with our policies. Before we get into the actual process by which this fiscal policy affects the macroeconomy, I want to talk for a little bit of time here about taxes and taxation. April 15th is coming up, but most people don't care about that because we have a delay in the time that you need to file your taxes. But you do have to pay your taxes eventually, and there are different kinds of taxes. We all pay taxes of some kind. Think about the different kind of taxes that you have to pay in your life. There are lots and lots of different kinds of taxes. For example, we have the income tax. And the income tax is not just a tax that you pay to the federal government, but in most states there's an income tax. Even in some localities there's an income tax. In the state of Pennsylvania, the income tax rate for everybody is 3.07%. But depending on where you live, you might have to pay an additional 1 to 2% or maybe even more in income taxes just to your local government. There are Social Security taxes. These are the taxes that are collected from your paycheck to help pay for the Social Security system. There are corporate income taxes. So these are taxes that corporations pay on the profits that they earn. There are property taxes, the taxes that you pay on your house, that you pay for boats, and in some states for your car. Every year you pay a property tax based on the value of your car. It's not a sales tax. Those are different kinds of taxes. There are sales and excise taxes, and depending on where you live, the sales and excise taxes might be different. So in Pennsylvania, we have a super high gas tax. If you go across the border into Ohio, gas prices are much less, in large part because there's a much smaller excise or specific sales tax on gasoline. In the state of Pennsylvania, we don't have sales tax on food or clothes. So at the Walmart in the town where I live, I'm close to the Ohio border, we see lots of cars from Ohio at our Walmart because they don't have to pay tax on food or clothes in Pennsylvania, but they do if they buy those things in Ohio. There are customs, which are just taxes on trade or tariffs. And in the last couple of years, we've heard a lot about tariffs, and we'll talk more about that when we get into international economics. There are lots and lots and lots of different types of taxes that we pay. These are the ways that governments raise revenue to spend money on the things that their constituents say they want governments to spend money on. But nobody likes paying taxes. Especially this one, the estate tax or the death tax. As Benjamin Franklin once said, there's only two things that are sure in life, that's death and taxes. And this kind of combines the two. So when you die, if you have an estate that's large enough, you will have to pay, or your heirs will have to pay taxes on the value of that estate. Even if you've paid taxes on the income and the property your whole life, you might have to pay tax on those properties even when you die. There are also different levels of taxation, and I've already alluded to some of these here. You've got your federal taxes, so that's like the federal income tax. You got to pay it. The Social Security tax, you've got to pay it. You can't get out of that by moving to a different state. But there are certain state taxes you can get away from. Like I mentioned, some sales taxes and excise taxes, you can get away from those things. I remember when I lived in Virginia, somebody was at the Costco just loading their car up to the top with cigarettes. And they just crammed as many cartons of cigarettes as they could into their car, and they headed north. And I know they headed north because later that day I heard a report on television about somebody being arrested with a car full of cigarettes. And they were on their way to New York to sell those cigarettes because they could resell the cigarettes in New York, make a profit on each pack that they sold, and still sell those packs of cigarettes for less than they would be sold for in New York State, because the state tax on cigarettes in New York is extraordinarily high. States have different levels of income tax as well. Once again, we'll use New York as an example. New York has one of the highest state income taxes in the country. Pennsylvania's is pretty low, and some states like Florida and Tennessee and Washington State have no state income tax at all. I remember when there was a move in Nashville, the state capital of Tennessee, to institute a state income tax. And the citizens of Tennessee, or a number of citizens of Tennessee, literally stormed the state house and started throwing rocks through the windows to express their displeasure with the idea of a state income tax. This was only 15 years ago or so. So we're not talking about the Revolutionary War times. We're talking about people being really, really upset about having to pay state income tax. And then you have your local taxes. So those are taxes that are levied at the local, the county, the township level. Those things can be specific sales taxes, like in Allegheny County. The sales tax is 7%, but in Beaver County and Butler County, it's only 6%. Local taxes are decided upon by the local government officials. So those are different kinds of taxes and different levels of taxation. But how are taxes levied? When we use that term levy, we're talking about the way that taxes are essentially imposed upon people. So how are taxes levied? Well, one of the more common ways that taxes are levied are through what's called the progressive income tax. We also have regressive taxes, which are Social Security taxes. And then we have proportional taxes. Proportional taxes are your sales, your property, and some types of income taxes. So what does it mean to levy an income tax or levy any kind of tax at all? Well, the way we levy a tax is hugely impacted by two tax philosophies, two different approaches, two different views of how taxes should be apportioned. One of those tax philosophies is called the ability to pay principle. And the ability to pay principle is basically the more you make, the more you pay. The higher your incomes, the greater your ability to pay. So the idea of proportional taxes, proportional income taxes, is a direct descendant from that ability to pay principle. The income tax is progressive, which means that the more you earn, the more you pay. Now, there are some specifics on that I want to get into here in a few minutes, but that's basically the idea of the income tax, at least the federal income tax. The more income you earn, the greater your ability to pay, so you're going to pay more. The other tax philosophy is called the benefits principle. The benefits principle says that if you benefit from the activity the government is spending its money on, then you should pay for it. This explains a lot of the ideas behind certain kinds of sales taxes. So we have a special tax on gasoline to help pay for the roads. The presumption is if you buy gasoline, you're going to use the roads, so you should pay for that. Social Security is kind of like that as well. It's a benefits principle that says that if you need to use Social Security when you retire, you should pay for it. So we all pay Social Security tax, but there's a point at which we stop paying Social Security tax. And that point is if you earn enough. And the presumption is that if you earn enough income, you're not going to need Social Security. So everybody pays Social Security taxes, but only up to a certain level of income. Now that level of income changes every year, so it's not incredibly important that we know specifically what that level is. At some point, if you earn enough money, your effective Social Security tax rate goes to zero. And that has an implication on the way we levy that tax and why it's called a regressive tax. So let's get into the difference between regressive and progressive taxes here. Oh, and the other type of tax was proportional. That just simply means that everybody pays the same tax rate no matter how much money you make. For example, in the state of Pennsylvania, everybody pays a 3.07% state tax rate regardless of your income. Sales taxes are proportional. Everybody pays the same percentage no matter how much you earn in terms of income. But regressive and progressive taxes, those are a little bit different. So we need to investigate them a little bit more. So I mentioned the idea of a progressive tax. The idea that as you earn more, you pay more. And here's why the rich pay more. These are the tax brackets for the United States. And if you notice, the more money you make, the higher your tax bracket. That's why the rich do pay more, as long as their income is actually normal income. If you make over $510,000 as a single person, $510,301, your income tax bracket is 37%. That's over a third of your income going to taxes. But if you only earn, say, $10,000, you're in the 12% tax bracket. So only 12% of your income goes to paying taxes. Now, that's sort of the way it works, but there's more detail, because think about this. Let's say that your boss came to you and offered you a raise. Let's say that right now you're making $39,000 in the 12% tax bracket. If your boss gave you a raise to $40,000, that's going to put you in the 22% tax bracket. That's a huge increase in the tax rate. And to avoid paying those taxes, you might decide, I don't want the raise, because that's going to mean I pay so much more in taxes. And that certainly would discourage giving raises. You'd never find anybody earning $39,476. But that's not the way the tax system works. The tax system is more complicated than that, to say the least. Let's say that you're a single person making $75,000 a year. Here's how the tax would break down. You would earn $9,700, that your first amount of income, but you only pay income at the 10% tax rate. Because it wouldn't be fair if people who are super poor paid at the 10% rate and people who had more money had to pay higher tax brackets. Again, it would discourage people from moving to higher tax brackets. So, on your first $9,700, you pay 10%. That means for that first amount of income, you pay $970. That's $9,700 times 10%. Then you move into the next tax bracket. So the next amount of income that you earn, the amount of income between $9,700 and $39,475. If we find the difference between those two numbers, $39,475 minus $9,700, the difference there is $29,775. That takes you from $9,700 up to the top of the tax bracket. You're going to pay income tax on that money, on the $29,775 at 12%. So the first amount of income you earn up to the top of the 10% bracket, you pay 10% income tax. The next amount of money that you earn between the bottom and the top of the 12% bracket, you pay 12% tax on, which is $3,573. The next bracket is the bracket you are in. That's where your $75,000 comes into play. Now, you're not going to pay 22% on all of your income. You're going to pay 10% on some of it, 12% on some of it, and 22% on some of it. How much of it? Well, it's just the difference between $39,475, the bottom of the bracket, and $75,000. So the difference between those two numbers is $35,525. That's the amount of your income that you would pay 22% in taxes on. So $35,525 times 22% gives you $7,815.50. So when you're calculating your taxes at $75,000 a year, you have some income that you get taxed at 10%, some at 12%, and some at 22%. And if we add that all up, your total tax is $12,358.50. Now, before we go any further, let's compare that to what you would pay if you had all of your income taxed at 22%. If that was the case, we'd take $75,000, we'd multiply that times 0.22, which is 22%, and your tax burden would be $16,500, which is way more than the amount of tax that you actually do pay. Because when we figure out taxes and what you owe as far as the federal income tax, we go through each of the brackets until we get to your income. And so as you earn more, you pay more, but it's always going to be less than the tax bracket that you are in. This gets to a really important distinction that we need to make. The distinction between what's called the marginal tax rate and the average tax rate. The marginal tax rate is the tax rate that you pay on the next dollar that you earn. So if you are in the 22% tax bracket at making $75,000 a year, the next dollar you earn would be taxed at 22%. So whatever tax bracket you're in, that's your marginal tax rate. The average tax rate is different. The average tax rate is the total amount of tax you pay divided by your income. And the average tax rate, except for the case when you're in the lowest tax bracket, the average tax rate will always be less than the marginal tax rate. Let's see why that's the case. So again, your average tax rate is the total tax you pay divided by your income. So if you earn $75,000, To determine the difference between the marginal tax rate and the average tax rate, we need to look at the numbers. Your marginal tax rate is your tax bracket, 22%. So again, the next dollar you earn is going to be taxed at 22%. But the average tax rate is the income tax that we calculated on the last slide, $12,358.50, divided by $75,000, which gives you an average tax rate of 16.48%. Again, the average tax rate will always be less than the marginal tax rate because your first amount of income is not taxed at your tax bracket rate. It's taxed at a lower rate. So let's get back to the idea of progressive taxes now. Remember, the progressive tax means that as you make more money, you pay more in taxes. But specifically, a progressive tax says that as you make more, your average tax rate increases. And that's why the rich pay more, as long as they're earning income. Interest and dividends, different types of income, interest that you earn on savings accounts, dividends that you're paid if you own stock, those are taxed at 15%. And that 15% tax rate is proportional. It doesn't matter how much income you earn. So Warren Buffett has famously said that his secretary pays more in taxes than he does. He may be a little disingenuous there because his secretary almost certainly earns normal income, and she almost certainly is in a higher tax bracket than the 15% tax bracket. If she isn't, then Mr. Buffett is not very generous. So her tax rate will be pretty high. But if Buffett only earns income through interest and dividends, he's only paying 15%, which is a lower tax rate than his secretary would pay. Progressive tax rates apply to your income, but interest and dividends are not considered the same types of income. Now, regressive taxes work in the opposite way. So a progressive tax means that if you earn more, you're going to pay a higher average tax rate. Basically, the more you make, the more you're paying in those higher tax brackets. So you've got to pay more in income tax. Regressive taxes are different, though. Regressive taxes mean that the more you earn, the lower your average tax rate. Regressive taxes, like the Social Security tax, work a little bit different. In the tax year 2020, once you hit an earning cap of $137,700, you stop paying Social Security taxes. And if you keep paying that, you will get those refunded to you. The rate on Social Security is 12.4%. You're supposed to pay half of it, and your employer pays half of it. So really, it's 6.2% for individuals. So your marginal tax rate, the rate that they take out of your pay, is 6.2%. Your average tax rate, if you earn $75,000, is also 6.2%. In fact, if you earn $10,000, it's 6.2%. Everybody pays 6.2%. There aren't different tax brackets for Social Security. So if you earn $75,000, we take that $75,000, multiply it by 6.2%, and the amount of tax that you pay is $4,650. If you earn more than this, let's say you earn $100,000, you would pay $6,200 in Social Security tax. You pay 6.2% of whatever income you earn up to $137,700. Once you hit that cap, the marginal tax rate becomes zero because you don't pay any more tax. You're effectively going from the 6.2% tax bracket to the 0% tax bracket, which makes this a great example of a regressive tax. In this case, the rich do pay a lower percentage of their income in Social Security taxes, and the rich meaning $137,700. So the marginal tax rate is 0. So the maximum Social Security tax that you can pay in the year 2020 is 6.2% times $137,700. That's the maximum that you will pay. Because if you earn $137,701, that $1 isn't taxed for Social Security. Now, that means that if you make, say, $500,000, your average tax rate is the amount of Social Security tax you pay. You pay the maximum. We divide that by $500,000, and that equals 1.7%. That's your average tax rate. Because you have these hundreds of thousands of dollars on which you are not paying Social Security tax. You're paying income tax, and you're paying a lot of income tax, but you're not paying Social Security tax. If you made $1 million, your average tax rate for Social Security is less than 1%. It's actually 0.85%. So the rich do pay a lower percentage of their taxes in terms of Social Security tax. And the reason is because, remember, the Social Security tax is collected to pay Social Security benefits. If you're making $500,000 a year, the presumption is that you can save for your own retirement and you don't need Social Security. So in the kind of the context of the benefits principle, you don't need Social Security, so you don't have to pay for it. All right, well, that brings us to kind of what's fiscal policy supposed to do for the macro economy. These are the nuts and bolts, really, the tax. And for some of you, I'm sure this seems like we're really getting into the weeds of tax policy. But I think it's important that you understand what's going on when you pay your taxes and what that means. But let's take a look. Let's kind of change gears here just slightly to see what it means for the macro economy when Congress starts passing fiscal policy. Just like monetary policy, we're going to see that there are two approaches to fiscal policy. We have the expansionary approach, and then we have the contractionary approach. So let's take a look at each one of those in detail to see what it means for the aggregate demand model, because that's where we can see what happens to GDP, employment, and inflation. Okay, when it comes to expansionary fiscal policy, policymakers can do one of two things. They can either cut taxes, that puts more money in your pocket, and usually that makes people happy. They get to keep more of what they make. Or government could increase spending. Can build more roads, more bridges, more schools, more hospitals, build up the military. They can, whatever they want to spend their money on, except for transfer payments, they can increase their spending, and that would lead to, would stimulate the economy. Now, for the most part, almost exclusively, fiscal policy focuses on aggregate demand. This makes all the sense in the world because that word says focus. This makes all the sense in the world because, remember, aggregate demand is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. Well, there's government spending for you. And when it comes to cutting taxes, those tax cuts affect your disposable income So that's going to affect consumption. So expansionary monetary or expansionary fiscal policy is directed either at increasing consumption, increasing government spending, or maybe a little bit of both. So let's see what the objective of this is, and see what's supposed to happen when expansionary fiscal policy is undertaken. So here's our familiar setup of long-run aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand. Everything comes together there in equilibrium. But if the economy is in recession, so if things are going badly, it might be down here at 82. So recession, that makes people sad. GDP has fallen. We saw what happens with monetary policy, with the attempt to shift that aggregate demand curve. Well, basically, fiscal policy is trying to do the same thing. We're trying to move the aggregate demand curve back to get us in that long-run equilibrium. So expansionary fiscal policy is trying to shift aggregate demand to the right. Try to increase aggregate demand to move us back to where we were in equilibrium before. And if it's successful, then what we should see is an increase in GDP, an increase in employment, or remember that's a decrease in unemployment, and of course there is the price consideration. There should be some inflation. But if the recession is bad enough, for example, the one people expect us to be in as a result of the COVID-19, the last thing most people are worried about is whether inflation goes up. The main goal, the thing that policymakers are most interested in, is trying to shift that aggregate demand curve back to the right to increase output and to get people back to work. The other thing that could be done is maybe the policymakers are worried that things are getting a little bit out of hand, or maybe they just want to collect more tax revenue to pay off the debts that they had. So they could engage in contractionary fiscal policy. Contractionary fiscal policy would involve increasing taxes or decreasing government spending. Either one of these two things will have an impact on aggregate demand. Because again, aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus NX. So if you decrease government spending, you're affecting the government component of aggregate demand. And if you increase taxes, you're causing people to be very sad because now they have less of their own income to take home and they have less to spend. So here's what that's going to look like if the government engages in this contractionary fiscal policy. There's long-run aggregate supply. Here's aggregate demand. And here is short-run aggregate supply. And so if the economy is way out here, where things are going, like gangbusters, GDP may be a little bit higher than is comfortable, and unemployment might be lower than is comfortable, and there might be some threat of inflation. And just to make this whole process more sustainable, we might use contractionary fiscal policy to shift aggregate demand back to the left. And the hope there would be that GDP would fall. Well, not the hope, of course. GDP would fall. We would see employment fall. Again, that means unemployment goes up. But inflation would come down as well. That's the goals, really, of contractionary fiscal policy. Now, all of this idea of fiscal policy kind of comes to a head with what's referred to as counter-cyclical policy. Countercyclical policy was the brainchild of this guy, a guy we've talked about in this class before, John Maynard Keynes. Keynes says that in bad times, the government needs to do things to stimulate the economy. It needs to increase government spending and it needs to increase taxes. In good times, though, the government should decrease government spending and raise taxes to pay back any debts that it has incurred during the bad economic times. Basically, you spend whatever you have to in the bad times, and then you pay it back in the good times. Which sort of makes sense. At least it makes sense for an individual. This is how we do things in our lives. If things are bad, if times are tough, we borrow money, we maybe spend money we don't have. We're doing things to try to take care of the present, and we'll deal with the consequences in the future. So here's what Keynes was talking about. If we go back to our business cycle model, and we have a business cycle that kind of looks like this, Keynes is basically saying, look, in bad economic times, in this area here where we are in a recession, we need to use fiscal policy to keep the lows of the business cycle from getting too low. Use fiscal policy, here, expansionary fiscal policy, to try to keep these things from getting out of hand. And then if things are really good, so maybe we're over here, we use contractionary fiscal policy to keep the economy from getting out of hand, from keeping inflation from getting too high. And if things are really good, people won't mind paying more in taxes to pay off any debt that we incurred when we spent money we didn't have. Now, this sounds normal, and we're used to seeing this in the political process, but when Keynes advocated this counter-cyclical policy, people thought he was nuts. This had never been done before. Governments had always tried to balance their budgets at the end of the fiscal year. Keynes said, who cares what the calendar says? Do things that are going to help the economy to try to stabilize it over a longer period of time. Now, there is one other thing that we need to consider. The fact that government spends money, however much money it spends, doesn't mean that that's the end of the spending process. Just like we saw with monetary policy, there was a money multiplier. Well, in the case of Keynes's recommendations for fiscal policy, there's actually a fiscal policy multiplier as well. The fiscal policy multiplier kind of works like this. It's like if government spends money, it ends up in the hands of somebody. Let's say they're building a road. Well, the government has to pay for supplies, they have to pay for more workers, and so there is income that comes to those individuals. There's that initial level of government spending. But when those people get their paychecks, they go out and start to spend money. Maybe they go out to dinner, and that ends up being revenue and income for the restaurant. And maybe the restaurant hires more workers, and that allows those new workers to go out and have a job and go out and spend money. So it's like throwing a rock in a pond, and you see those ripple effects. That's kind of like what the fiscal policy multiplier is. And it relies upon, or is based upon, something we call the marginal propensity to consume. The marginal propensity to consume is the change in your consumption divided by the change in income. So let's say you find $1 on the ground. What percentage of that dollar you spend is the marginal propensity to consume? Maybe $1 is not a good example. Let's say you have $1,000. How much of that are you going to spend, and how much of it are you going to save? That's what the marginal propensity to consume is asking. What percentage of a new dollar will you spend versus how much will you save? We use that marginal propensity to consume to determine the spending multiplier. The spending multiplier is equal to this equation, 1 divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. This is all kind of theoretical though, so let's take a look at how, let's put some numbers to this and see how we calculate the spending multiplier and then what that means for the economy. Let's say the government spends $2 billion. what's the impact going to be? If the marginal propensity to consume is 0.7, then consumption is going to increase by the marginal propensity to consume, which is 0.7, times $2 billion. So consumption goes up by 1.4 billion. But it doesn't stop there. GDP as a whole increases by a lot more than $1.4 billion. How much more is going to be determined by the multiplier. So the multiplier, again, is 1 divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. The marginal propensity to consume is 0.7. So we put that into our equation here. 1 divided by 0.3 gives us a multiplier of 3.33. So let's take that multiplier and figure out what the total change in GDP will be. To do that, we take the multiplier, 3.33, and multiply it times our $2 billion in government spending, which gives us a change in GDP of $6.67 billion. At least that's the projection, that's the possibility. So a government increasing spending by $2 billion, or $1 trillion, or $2 trillion, whatever the number ends up being, in terms of coronavirus stimulus, it's going to have a much bigger impact on the economy, depending upon what happens with that multiplier. What's the multiplier number? You can think about it in this way. Here is GDP and the price level, and here is aggregate demand. When government spends, we have that initial pop in aggregate demand, and then there is another change in aggregate demand as that ripple effect starts to make itself felt. Now the ripples get smaller and smaller, but aggregate demand keeps moving out further and further. So if we put an aggregate supply curve in here, short-run aggregate supply curve, we see that the impact, while it gets less over time, it still is pushing that GDP further and further outwards to the right. That's what the multiplier effect illustrates. So that brings us to one last thing that we need to talk about in terms of fiscal policy, and that's the difference between deficits and debt. A deficit occurs when you have, in a year, when you spend money that you don't have, when your costs are greater than your revenues. And most of you all live in a time period right now where you have these deficits every year. You have to borrow money to go to school, and you don't have the money, so you borrow it, and then at the end of the year, you've spent more money than you have coming in. Governments do this too. But if you have a deficit year after year after year, then you end up with what we call a debt. Debt is just accumulated deficits over time. So your student loan debt, whatever it ends up being, is the accumulation of 4 years of borrowing money to go to school. Governments have these deficits and debts too. For a government, a deficit exists when they have more expenses than they bring in tax revenue. The deficit occurs when they do this year after year after year. So most governments around the world have significant debt because they run deficits year after year. Part of those deficits exist because of times where the government has tried to help the economy out. Remember, Keynes said, this is good, this is what governments should be doing. It's paying those debts back where politics kind of gets in the way of the good economics. You can think about debts and deficits like an iceberg. The debt is the stuff you can't see. The deficit is the stuff you can see. The deficit is like the small amount of the iceberg that's sticking out of the water, where the big part of the iceberg is the debt. And there's only so much the government can do to address its deficits every year. That has to do with what we call discretionary versus mandatory spending. Mandatory spending are things that governments have to spend money on. They don't have a choice. There are laws written that says you must spend money on these programs. Things like welfare and Social Security and food stamps. Governments have to spend money, at least the US government has to spend money on those things because that's what the law says. If you want to change the amount of spending in those areas, you have to change the law, and that's kind of a pain in the neck. Discretionary spending is the stuff you have discretion over, the types of spending where you can change without changing the law. These are things like education spending and environmental spending and defense spending. Those are types of spending that can be changed relatively easily if you have a political consensus. All right, so that is fiscal policy kind of in a nutshell. Fiscal policy, we kind of ran through a lot of material there relatively quickly. Fiscal policy is just the taxing and spending behaviors of government. And this is one of the reasons why it's important to pay attention who you vote for, because they have the power to set the fiscal policy agenda for the country. And as we have seen over the last 20 years, 25 years or so, politicians aren't really good at controlling the purse strings. If that's something you're worried about, then you want to go vote for someone who has a little bit, at least promises that they're going to try to rein in spending. If you think government should be doing more, then you want to take a look at politicians who advocate for giving things away. Either side, however, there are consequences to. If fiscal policy is too strict, if taxes are too low, then government can't help but run budget deficits. If governments give away too much and they don't have enough revenue coming in, governments can't help but have budget deficits. So hopefully this kind of primer on fiscal policy gives you an indication as to what politicians are doing, what they can do, and also what it means when you're paying your taxes, which you will have to eventually, but at least you don't have to right away.